to the Hometown Church Podcast. My name is Jesse, and I am joined by Pastor Brent today.
Yes, it's good to be here. It's good to be here. My head is spinning, all the things that are going on with the news lately.
Yeah.
My head's spinning. So good thing we can trust in God and we're not trusting in government.
That's right, yeah. Lot of stuff going on. It's kind of hard to keep up with it all, keep track of it all. But luckily, that's what we're all going to talk about today is everything going on in the world. And we're going to set everything straight for you guys so that there's no confusion by the end of this conversation.
Big promises.
Yeah. One thing you'll probably notice, Pastor Deacon is not with us today. He was going to be here, but we had some scheduling conflicts, so it's just going to be me and Pastor Brent here talking politics and government and all that fun stuff. But yeah, we wish Deacon could be here, but he'll be back not next week because we won't have an episode next week, but the week after. We'll have Pastor Deacon back, and maybe you'll be joining us because I think Kit's going on vacation.
I don't know. I guess we'll have to work that through.
We'll figure it out. We got a couple weeks. We got MTOC coming up. That's this week. So, yeah, we're all hands on deck for that. But we're still going to take time to have this conversation here today. Today we are going to be continuing our walk through the book of Acts. So if you've been following along with us, you know that throughout the summer we've been going through the Acts as a series as a church through a 13-week sermon series, and we're using this podcast as a space to go a little bit more in depth on some of the topics that we've covered in this series. Last Sunday, Brent, you shared a message called "In Government We Trust," where you talked all about the relationship the church has with the government, the kind of two-edged sword that we see with the government to both protect and to persecute. Right now, government and politics is something that is on the minds of a lot of people with it being an election year, and things are just getting crazier than ever in the political landscape, right? Especially after the assassination attempt that happened last week on President Trump, and now President Biden just dropping out of the race just yesterday as we're recording this. So a lot of things are going on. It's a topic that gets people very passionate very quickly and can quickly turn hostile towards each other, and a lot of Christians are just kind of wondering, how do we respond during this time? What is our role, and what should we be doing going forward? So today we're going to get into all that. Brent, are you ready for that conversation?
Wow. Well, that title of the message, "In Government We Trust," I was a little tongue-in-cheek. Mm-hmm. And so we'll trust God rather than our government.
Yeah, a little clickbaity, some would say.
Clickbaity, yeah. Yeah, but that's what happens, right? When government looms too large in our eyes and God gets too small in our eyes, then we get a little too much wrapped up in government. Emotions spin out of control and we get anxious. And so it's in God we trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into that conversation, I just wanted to mention something quickly from last week's conversation. Pastor Kit asked me to make a quick correction. If you were listening in last week, there was a moment where we got a little confused and we were kind of trying to figure some stuff out. Pastor Kit mentioned that Peter didn't show up in Acts between chapters 4 and 15. And we're like, that wasn't true. we were both kind of like trying to figure out what was going on. And what we figured it out like right after the recording was that he was mixing up chapters 12 and 4, two different instances where Peter has a run-in with some religious leaders or government officials. And it's in chapter 12 where it says that he departs and goes off to another place and then doesn't show up until 15. So Kit wanted me to make sure I mentioned that so that there wasn't any confusion in case you were listening to that and cut off.
We don't want to be idiots,
right? Yeah. But we all make mistakes. We all kind of get things mixed up every once in a while. But a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. Let's jump right into this conversation. I'd like to start by just kind of getting your reaction to some of the big recent political events. First with the assassination attempt on President Trump, and then on the news that just broke yesterday of President Biden dropping out of the race. What's kind of your reaction to all that, and how should Christians be responding?
Well, you're asking a really, really huge question, and there are reactions going on all over the place. I remember I was at a gathering with a bunch of hometowners and others the Saturday that Trump's assassination attempt occurred, and my son, he pulled out his phone and he got a text from one of his brothers, and he says, "Dad, you gotta see this," and we saw the blood mark on Trump, and it was just unfolding, and everybody in this event pulls out their phones and starts looking at it. I remember the days when we used to gather around TV sets as a community and watched significant events unfold. But now everybody just gets out their phones and looks at it for themselves. So it's kind of funny. I'm not a social media guru, but there is a lot going on in social media right now. And the Republican National Convention last week, there was a lot being said and interpreted about the assassination attempt, and the reactions are ranging, across the spectrum. Evidently there are a lot of people out there that wish the bullet had moved a half an inch to the right. One post that was reported to me, someone said, "Hey, when at first you don't succeed, try again." And it's interesting how this plays into people's passions here. Came across a study the other day, a 2023 study from the University of Virginia. Virginia's Center for Politics found that 40% of both Biden and Trump supporters support this statement. They at least somewhat believed that the other side had become so extreme that it's acceptable to use violence to prevent them from achieving their goal. 40%.
Wow.
And let's just say that violence is not a justifiable political tool. The assassination attempt on President Trump, as he spoke at that Pennsylvania rally, is an act that deserves condemnation across our society. And every Christian should be sitting there thinking, now that's wrong. Murder and its attempt is a violation of God's law. It's an attack on a person who's made in the image of God, regardless of what you think his political views are. So we've got to reject all political violence and remind those who even are joking about it that this is not a good thing. It's a terrible thing that it happened. It has no place in our society, and we must not give it any place in our fellowship among believers. And as long as nations and governments exist, there are going to be political disagreements, right? There's going to be differences, and we need to be able to find the grace to speak of candidates and one another in ways that are not dehumanizing. Now, so that's one thing I want to say, but I think what's really interesting is the interpretation that's occurring of this event that President Trump tilted his head just at the right time as 3 bullets are passing by. I got another a text from one of my boys my sons who showed a diagram of how the bullets were just missing his head just at the right time. One of them, of course, crosses his ear, gets his ear, and then he adds this: something supernatural happened that day. Well, that's an interesting question, isn't it? To ask, did something supernatural happen that day? Well, it certainly was the providence of God. This might dip back to our conversations on Deacon's thoughts on the difference between providence and God's miracles. Yeah, we could say God's hand was involved with it. His hand was providentially involved with it. But how do you interpret that? And I think that's interpretation is really critical here. And so at the Republican National Convention, both delegates and speakers, they wasted no time giving their interpretation. I just want to give you some quotes that happened from both delegates and speakers at the Republican National Convention. Here's one quote: "It was divine intervention. I 100% believe that God was with them," unquote. Another quote is, "I think that this is a fight between good and evil, and I think evil is going to lose. If he created this world and loves it, why would he let the evil one win?" Unquote. At a speech, someone said, "2 days ago, evil came for a man we admire and love so much. I thank God that his hand was on President Trump," unquote. Here's another quote. God spared President Trump from that assassin because God is not finished with him yet, unquote. Well, something providential did happen. Again, it's how you interpret it, and how you interpret it could take you in different directions. Well, providentially, I just happened to be reading a book, a biography on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a strong believer in Germany at the time of the rise of Adolf Hitler. He was involved in an assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler, and I read the assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler, and it was amazing how he was spared. Someone just took a briefcase that was placed underneath his desk that was loaded with explosive, didn't think anything about the briefcase, just happened to move it in another place in the room or in another room. The bomb exploded, and Adolf Hitler, providentially by circumstance, escaped from death. And as a result of that event, Hitler claimed divine providence after his assassination attempt. And in his radio broadcast following the failed plot, Hitler explicitly referred to his survival as confirmation of divine intervention and his special purposes. And so he took that to the bank, that providence was with him and endorsing who he was and what he was all about. So I have been praying fervently for President Trump ever since, because how you interpret this could take you in two different directions. It could take you in the direction of pride, that I am God's man for this hour and God's endorsing everything that I do. It could take you that way. Mm-hmm. Or it could take you down a road of more of humility, where he could conclude, you know what, I'm fragile. If that bullet had moved a half an inch to the right, I would not be standing here today. I'm fragile. I could die at any time, and I need God's help. And this could go in two different directions, and I'm praying for Trump that he would interpret it with humility and that he would understand his fragility. So unfortunately, I think maybe some Christians are out there placing too much emphasis on God's providence here, and maybe interpreting it in ways that shouldn't be. I think we just need to be really careful here. Let's pray. It's motivated me to pray for our government more than ever. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one where I don't think we need to jump to quick interpretations, and I think we can kind of let it play out and just see. I think prayer is a big thing. It's just crazy that this is kind of the world that we're living in, is because it's been so long since something like this has happened. I think 1981 was the last time that that there was an attempted assassination on a president. That was long before I was even alive. So for me, this is a very first new thing. I was out on the boat on that Saturday. We were going around tubing, and get home, and I'd go in to take a shower, and I get a text from my sister. They shot at Trump, and I was like, "Oh wow, this is wild." So then I get on YouTube and I start trying to find all the information I can about it. I even re-download Twitter. I don't have Twitter on my phone for the most part, but I'm like, I got to see what people are saying about this thing, and you just got to try to tune into it. But and then you just see so many different interpretations from different people. It's like, this is God's providence. So many conspiracy theories and things that have spun off from this. Yeah, and then other people will be trying to connect it to Revelation 13 with the beast who appeared to have a mortal wound. The mortal wound in his head and recovered. Yeah, I've heard that one too. Yeah, so you could go any direction you want with this, but I think it's just placing our trust in God rather than in the people that are in these positions. Any thoughts on the Biden stepping down on? Well, let me just one last thought on the assassination attempt. I think another appropriate response is to give thanks that President Trump was spared. Yeah. Think about how this country would be different right now today if if, well, let me just say it, his head exploded on TV in front of an American audience, and how this country potentially could have been torn apart if that happened. And so I think we can be extraordinarily thankful that it worked out the way it did. And I think we could be also at the same time grieving for the innocent people, the one person that did die and a couple others who were injured. And the trauma from such a loss and pain is great. And we need to feel the sorrow that they're going through. And so I think those are other appropriate responses of this assassination attempt. Now, regarding President Biden dropping out, I don't know that I have much thoughts to share there, other than that I'm thankful that his pride eventually didn't win out. I think it was a good idea that he dropped out, and probably it was his pride that kept him going for so long. I think it would have been, my personal opinion, bad for the country if he had continued. So I'm thankful that he dropped out of the race.
Yeah, I think it was getting to the point where it was kind of hard to deny that there wasn't something going on there, that age wasn't starting to play a factor. Right. And and just trust that God's in control, no matter who the nomination is or who the president-elect is come November.
Right.
Yeah. So political issues are something that are extremely divisive, especially in election years. Some people say that we shouldn't be talking about politics altogether, like the church should try to keep that separate as much as possible. Other people say that we need to be talking about this all the time, having as much influence, making sure people are as well informed on a Sunday at church as possible. How important is it for churches to be talking about political issues, and how often should we be talking about them?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, government should be talked about in the context of a church at least once in a while, because government is part of God's design, right? I mean, it says that in Romans 13, and you see issues of government and believers and God's people interacting with government, secular government, woven in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So as Christians, we do have a responsibility towards government. Government matters. This is one of the points that I was trying to make with the message this last weekend. It affects our lives. It can affect our lives. And character of government leaders matters, because effective leadership rests on good character. Policy of government matters. Some policy edges into biblical morality and biblical ethics. And yet, as important as government is, it is not the focus of the New Testament. It has, some exposure in the New Testament, but not a lot. So how much do we talk about government? Well, how much does the New Testament talk about government? Well, there's some things in there, but not a large percentage of the New Testament is talking about government. And so in a rough sense, maybe that's how much we should emphasize government, as much as the New Testament does, which is not a whole lot. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just thinking about the New Testament, we don't get a ton of conversation about government. In the Old Testament, we get a lot of conversation about the government, and that's mainly because it's written to a people, a nation that is God's own nation. But even thinking about in the prophets, what their main role was as prophets, right? We often just go to the prophets and be like, oh, what's the predictions about Jesus in the future and stuff like that. But their main role was really as social critics, and criticizing the government and criticizing Israel's leaders for their moral failings. But then they also criticized the surrounding nations and for their moral failings and what they're doing wrong. So I just think it's interesting how prevalent that is throughout the Old Testament, and then it just kind of gets sprinkled in through the New Testament. And we see it, the shift kind of gets for Jesus, the shift kind of comes in where he starts criticizing the religious leaders rather than the political leaders. But there is still that political aspect where the people who are in charge of the government are still going to be held accountable for the decisions and stuff that they make. And so we need to be aware of these things, and because it's on God's heart, right?
Yeah, and at the same time, you don't see the epistles or Paul spending much time criticizing the Roman government.
Right.
That just wasn't his ministry. His focus was the gospel, being a kingdom of God outpost of local churches. And Peter calls us exiles, strangers in the world, and we are going to be in the midst of this world with all types of governments, both good and bad, and what is going to eventually change the world is not going to be a change of regime of government. It's going to be because people get saved and the gospel advances. So I think that's the ball we need to keep our eye on.
And we need heart change rather than policy change.
That's right. That's right.
For sure. So in looking at policies, there's a lot of different political issues that people are very passionate about. Are there any political issues that the church should be taking a hard stance for or against? And if so, what are they?
Well, yes. This goes right to the heart, though, of our form of government. If we were in a dictatorship or an authoritarian government, that we couldn't really even participate in the political process, I might answer this question a little differently, because we might say, what options do we even have? I think that there is a special stewardship, though, that we have because God, in His providence, has allowed this country to arise with the principles of our founding fathers, as Abraham Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address. He says, "This government is for the people." How does he? So by the people, for the people. There was one more, but the point being is that this government has been established. This government rests on the ability of people to self-govern and express that self through a democratic republic. And this country is based on the people being able to vote and to govern. So we've got a lot of power in that sense. And so we can participate in the political process. We have the stewardship that God's given us. We need to manage that stewardship well. And so we get presented with certain political issues that have moral implications. Should the church be taking any hard stances on political issues? If so, what are they? Well, I think there are some that are strikingly clear. Abortion would be one of those. Abortion, bottom line, is just wrong. But when things start coming down to policy, things get a little murkier. I had a conversation with a close friend of mine the other day who leans in the Democratic Party direction because she feels like that their policies have really actually helped lower the abortion rate. And statistically, that's been the case by helping policies that help women better access to birth control, helping economic status of poor women, etc. And she feels that party has more of a whole life presentation, a whole life concern, and so that she leans Democratic, and statistically, the abortion rate has declined from 2010 to 2019 by and large, and so we got to be a little careful on closely associating one party is more moral than another. Because abortion is just one of those issues. Immigration is another thorny issue, That's a sticky issue for Christians. On the one hand, the Bible encourages welcoming the immigrant and the stranger. On the other hand, the Bible also encourages law and order. That gets all put in with the immigration issue. There's freedom of religion issues. Is the government going to force, for instance, churches to hire transsexuals or force and dictate how churches meet? I think these are all pretty clear issues, but then there are other issues. What about racial harmony or creation care? Don't we have a stewardship as Christians to treat our creation well? Law and order. There's issues of national defense, national debt. Can we keep spending more money than we have? All this gets pushed down into policy issues, which make sometimes things real tough to make a call. But there are some things that I think there are clear.
Yeah. I think the big thing is just don't vote against your conscience, right? Like,
sure.
Yeah, I think I was looking for it, but I couldn't think of the exact reference of if it's against your conscience, it's a sin to you, even if it's not a sin to the greater body of Christ, right? I think it's in reference to like eating meat sacrificed to idols and stuff like that.
Yeah, you're talking about Romans 14.
That's the one I was thinking of.
Yeah.
And so this idea of if you can't in good conscience vote for something, then don't vote for it. Right.
Just make sure your conscience is biblically informed.
Yes.
Because sometimes your conscience can be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Make sure you're in line with Scripture first, and then follow the convictions of your heart with that are in line with that. And then I think the moral superiority thing complex is something that I've been thinking about recently. I think whatever side you fall on, the trap that you can fall into is thinking that you're the morally superior party or the morally superior person because of that, and the person who believes this thing is actually the morally inferior person. I think of the is that Matthew 18 or 13, the story where Jesus talks about the religious man and the sinner that both go to the temple, and the one is praying and he's saying to God, I'm just so thankful that I'm not like this other guy, and the other one's saying, God, I'm a sinner, I need your grace. One of those two guys comes away justified, and which one is it? It's the one who recognizes his sin and it repents and calls out for God's mercy, and the other guy is sitting there prideful thinking, at least I'm not like this other guy. So I think that's the big thing that we need to be wary of, especially when there are things that there is a hard line morally, but when we can have disagreements on what the best way to go about regulating those moral issues is not becoming the Hippocratic Pharisee who's sitting there praying, thank God I'm just not like this other guy. Thank God I'm not like those Democrats. Thank God I'm not like those Republicans.
Yeah, self-righteous pride.
Right.
Yeah. And by the way, I think that has a big implication on in the church accepting one another. Mm-hmm. I think it's very legitimate that people who are motivated by compassion and kindness, for instance, might land on policies that are helping the poor and helping the single woman and helping supporting policies that support a woman after she births a baby and adoption things and things like that, and might end up then in their conscience voting for a Democratic platform, for instance. And I can completely understand that. And in their conscience, they're following a path where I am following God. I've got biblical principles that are leading me in that particular direction, whereas somebody of the Republican ilk might go a different direction. Mm-hmm. And going back to your thought of the conscience, if our conscience before God is leading us in a particular direction and ends up voting differently, well, can we not accept one another?
Yeah.
And love one another anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one thing just to add there too, like it's okay to be angry about things. I think too, like moral problems in the world, like abortion. I think it's okay to be angry at those things as long as you're angry at the right thing, right? That we don't that we remember that our battle is not against flesh and blood,
Yeah, there you
but
go.
against the powers, right? That there is just evil in the world, and it's okay to be angry and hate the evil that's in the world, as long as we're not confusing that with hating the people on the other side.
Yep. Good.
Yeah. So we kind of talked about this a little bit, but the early church, and maybe this is a reason why government doesn't get talked about as much in the New Testament, is because the context of the early church, they didn't have any political power. They didn't have any say on how policies were formed. But that is very different in the modern church. And we talked about this a little bit last week too, of how America is very much a historical anomaly when it comes to the church, where we don't really experience the same types of persecution that we have in the past. And a lot of that, it comes down to us being founded on Christian beliefs, and that being kind of a lot of how the country came to be and how we formed the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so now Christians have, in America at least, have much more say on how policies are made and how we go about doing these different things. So how are Christians morally obligated to vote and to participate in these things?
Well, I think so, but we got to admit that there is no command in the Bible that says thou shalt vote.
Mm-hmm.
It's not there for the reasons I think that you stated. So it's not a solid line but there's a dashed line. I think it leads us to the responsibility to vote. Again, I mentioned this a little earlier, but we have been given a stewardship to manage
Mm-hmm.
in the form of our government. So there's a responsibility. God has given us this gift of, wow, you get to participate in this government. Really, the people are the government. And if that's the case, then we need to obey God and govern well, just in a sense, just like it says in Romans 13, that governing authorities are under responsibility by God, chosen by God to be servants of the people. Well, in a sense, we are that government. And so we have a responsibility to govern well, and how we express that governance is by voting primarily. And it could take other forms as well, talking to our representatives, influencing our representatives. We've got options that we can go down the road, but at the very least, I think we need to vote, and I think we need to pray. And that mandate for being involved in our government is clear, is praying for our governing leaders. So at least those two. And God may call some of us to get even more involved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's something that I've kind of gone back and forth with, of feeling like, oh man, I don't really like thinking about politics. I don't really like having conversations about politics. I'd rather just kind of like not think about it at all, and then feeling like a little bit of convicted about that. It's like because there is this stewardship aspect that it's been placed in our hands. This is the context that we're put in, and so these are real issues. And if we just choose to be ignorant about things, like that's not good, right? Because there are real people suffering. I got to imagine. Like I've been reading the prophets recently on my own time, so I've just been kind of thinking about those things. And like when Jeremiah and Isaiah, they're criticizing Jerusalem and Israel, and for not caring for the widows and the poor, and it's like, well, most people probably weren't in a situation where they were like having to think about this constantly, because it's getting placed on the government, but it's on everyone to like take care and be thinking about these things and working for change and working to love each other and love God first. So I think it is very important for us to be involved and at least be informed. And I think for myself, it is, you need to cast your vote and participate in this thing.
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So one question that kind of comes up a lot, especially now when we have such a visceral, maybe is the right word, debates between presidents who are, it feels like they've just become angry at each other, and they're just like yelling insults at each other, with like debates and all that stuff. And so a lot of people will say, I don't find President Trump to be a very honorable person. He's morally corrupt, or they saw Biden before he dropped out, President Biden, as morally corrupt. And so the question is, how do we honor leaders? Because we have this command to honor leaders who we don't see as honorable.
Well, right. And I'm glad you said that there was a command there. And we have to think of the cultural context and when that command was given. And we'll talk about the command here in a moment. But when Peter was writing his epistle, who was leading the Roman government back then? How honorable were the Caesars back then? Mm-hmm. Were they honorable people? Well, history shows us that when it comes to the Christian ethic, they were not honorable at all, especially with their personal character. And yet there's this pesky little command in 1 Peter 2, verse 17. It says, show proper respect to everyone, love the brotherhood of believers, fear God, honor the king. The ESV actually says honor the emperor. And so what does that look like? What did that look like back then? What does that look like for us in present day America? I think there's some things that we should be alert to. I think we should be alert to how we talk about presidential candidates, even those of the opposite side. Are we gossiping? Are we slandering? This is a tough one. We probably ought to take a step back and think about the language that we're using and how are we creating a atmosphere with our family, with our friends, that we're honoring people that God has placed there, even though they may not have an honorable character. Do we have a basic stance of submission? For instance, that's the basic command God gives believers in Romans 13, that we're to submit to our governing authorities. Other things like pay taxes, they're just certain. There's a certain stance that we need to follow the governing authorities and obey their authority and submit to their authority just as a basic stance in life. Of course, there's going to be limits to that. If a governing authority, tells us to sin, we respect God more than we respect governing authorities. But our basic stance ought to be one of honor, one of respect.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think of the story of Paul in chapter 23 when he's arrested in Jerusalem. He's taken before the council, and the high priest comes out before him, Ananias, and Paul says to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. You're sitting to judge me according to the law, yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck. And they're like, hey, you're talking to the high priest. And he immediately backtracks. He goes, I didn't know, brothers, I didn't know he was the high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler. And this is a guy who's persecuting him, who's unjustly abusing his authority to strike him, to try and kill him ultimately. And yet Paul still in that moment goes back and says, well, God said I can't speak ill of this guy, so I'm not going to. I'm going to show him the honor. I'm going to show the position the honor, even though he's not doing something that's honorable.
Yeah, that's an interesting example.
Yeah. And then Jesus too, when talking about the Pharisees, it says that they sit on the seat of Moses, on the throne of Moses or something like that. They judge on the seat of Moses. I'm trying to think. This is just coming to me in the moment, so maybe I'm just making stuff up. I don't think so. But he's like, they have true authority. They're sitting on the seat of Moses, but they're abusing it, and the seat should be honored, but not their actions.
There you go.
Yeah. I think that's good. One thing that people have become worried about, and I think is kind of the other edge of that sword of the government protecting, right, is the government persecuting. How you see it right now, how worried should Christians be about the government becoming tyrannical?
Well, this is one of the points I wanted to make in the message, but let's keep in mind that most governments in the history of the world have been overly authoritative.
Mm-hmm.
And Christians have had to live under those governments for most of the history of the world. Really, it's only been in America and some other Western countries where Christians have been able to live in freedom of religion and not had to worry about it. But that's been rare. We're in an historical anomaly,
Mm-hmm.
a kind of this bubble of protection, if you will. And how long will that last? I don't know. I had an interesting conversation with my brother-in-law, who's also a pastor, and he's done a lot more research into the principles of the founding of our country and what our founding fathers have, what motivated him to do what they did. And one of his conclusions after studying is that this American experiment, see, our founding fathers realized that what they were doing had never been done in the history of the world before. And it was all resting, and they knew this, and they've written about it. They knew that this American experiment was based on the ability of people to self-govern under the fear of God. And if our governing system is built on this foundation, then what is going to happen when the majority of the people in the country are no longer able to self-govern in the fear of God? And he wonders if this country is getting to a tipping point that because there is a lack of the fear of God, the lack of ability to self-govern, and if our government rests on that, what is going to happen if that self-governance, that ability to do it, crumbles?
Mm-hmm.
And he's wondering if what will happen to the United States is that it will either descend into chaos, or maybe even more so, somebody is going to rise up and be very authoritative because people will be willing to give up their personal freedom for the prospect of peace. So how long will the United States last in the way it is? Who knows? But are we pointed in a good direction? Probably not.
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems like a lot of the political tactics, the campaign tactics, are all kind of centered around this, trying to create fear of that happening, that of the other side trying to make that happen.
For sure.
And so it's like you hear a lot from the left talking about how if Trump gets elected, this is the end of democracy, and he's going to become he's going to become a dictator.
Yeah.
And then the right will see, if the left gets elected again, they're going to try to make us into a socialist country. It'll turn into a communist country. It'll turn into a dictatorship. So it's like it's the same fear on both sides. And something I've just kind of heard talked about a little bit is like how our country is kind of founded. It's an experiment, right? It's very young in the grand scheme of the world. 300 years is like hardly anything. And so it is this experiment, but it's founded on this idea of checks and balances, that there's the different governing branches that are all kind of meant to keep each other in check, and either those checks and balances will hold up and we'll be able to sustain this for a while, or they won't hold up and everything will kind of collapse in on itself. And then it's, well, what was your trust ever in the government, or was your trust in God ultimately, right? And if it's in God, then you don't really need to worry about it. There's things to think about, and but it's ultimately our hope is in God and not in the government.
Right, and I think the fear is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
We hope to talk about fear sometime this fall as we're leading up to the campaign, because fear is a big political motivator.
Mm-hmm.
And fear gets people to contribute dollars. And if you keep listening to your silo of information, then it would be very easy to be influenced by fear.
Yeah.
And that this is the most important election in the history of our country. How many times has that been said?
Mm-hmm.
And well, I'm sure it is important, but God's in control, and we can rest in God. And if we're being motivated by fear, we'll end up and being anxious. We'll end up making decisions and going in directions that are not going to be healthy.
Right. Yeah. That's good. So with the election coming up, one thing that we need to, and kind of what you're talking about there, with this idea of fear, is I've been thinking about the relationship between fear and love recently, and Tim Keller talks about this. Is that we think hate is the opposite of love. And he talks about how fear is actually the opposite of love, because fear will drive us to act in self-preservation to protect ourselves, even if it hurts somebody else, where love will drive us to act self-sacrificially. And as Christians, we're called to love one another. And so, as John would put it in his letter, right, perfect love casts out all fear.
Okay.
And so that these political campaigns and this two-party system is all based on fear, of fearing the other side and fearing the outcome if the other side gets control or power. So I'm trying to tie this back into the question of how can Christians seek unity with brothers and sisters who disagree with them and avoid becoming obsessed with politics?
Well, I think there's by the way, let me advertise a upcoming series in September and October leading up to the election. We hope to deal with more thoroughly with issues like this. Mm-hmm. So those message series are being constructed as we speak, and you can look forward to maybe us getting into this a little bit more. But there are a lot of heart issues that pull at our unity. And you mentioned one, fear is one. Pride is a heart issue that pulls at our unity. There are other things that pull at our unity. And we have, as a church, have a tremendous opportunity as we walk down this road, with our whole culture being polarized and fractured and divided. What is God calling the church to be like during this time? Well, I think just the opposite of that. The God's calling the church to be unified. Why did Jesus spend his last moments centering in that prayer when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying for the unity of the church in John chapter 17? Because this was so centered to him, and our witness to the world, and what he was all about is that it would be unified. And there's a lot to that. Like we even talked about earlier, part about being unified is accepting one another, even if our consciences are leading us in different directions. We accept that about one another. We learn how to disagree with one another in an agreeable way, and so those are a few thoughts I want to throw to the table. Do you got any more yourself?
Yeah, I think it's just making sure we're centering ourselves on Christ, and making sure our relationship with God is coming first. And so that's, making sure you got your quiet time in every day. Making sure you're praying, and making sure your relationship with God is solid, and that's the foundation of your life, rather than, what's the first thing you do? You open up Twitter and start scrolling through political takes and hearing people argue all the day, or are you starting off with a moment of silence and prayer and reminding yourself of who you actually serve? I think that's been big for me, of just like praying through the Lord's Prayer, of starting with, God, your kingdom come, your will be done, right? Not the kingdom of America come, the kingdom, or the will of the president be done, or my will be done. Right. It's no, I'm a part of something else. I'm a part of a kingdom that's not of this world.
Right. You have a higher allegiance.
Yeah.
You have a higher allegiance to King Jesus. You have more of allegiance to Jesus than you do to the Republicans or to the Democrats or to the Libertarians or whatever. And people become obsessed with politics when they feel like that is the hope of the world. Yeah. And it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's good. So I think it's that, and then I think it's just remembering that love is a choice. Love is not something that we don't have control over, but we can choose to love even if we disagree. And so Jesus said, "You'll be known. The world will know you by your love that you have for one another." Right. So choosing love, even if we disagree with our brothers and sisters, is a big thing.
disagree agreeably.
Yeah. We can be nice about it.
Yeah, we sure can.
Yeah. So who should people vote for?
Let your conscience dictate that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I threw that one in there without telling. I was just joking. I didn't
Right,
expect you.
right.
But, no, just to get your reaction out of that. But any final thoughts? Anything that you want the people
I
to know?
don't think so. This subject could be endless, you know, and I think we did talk about some good things here today. But as always, if you got questions or comments, get those emails coming, and we'd be love to be able to answer questions.
Yeah, I'm sure there is more than a few questions that people have surrounding politics. I just wrote down a few that came to mind quickly, but I'm sure there's a bunch that I haven't thought of. So if there is anything else that you guys want us to talk about or are wondering about and want to hear the perspective of the pastors on, please send those in to us at podcast@hometownchurch.com. We got our own email now. You don't have to email me and Deacon separately. You can just send those to us and we'll get them. We'll hopefully be able to answer those on a future podcast or next. Well, we won't be here next week. I think I said that at the beginning. But we're taking next week off because it's MTOC and we got a bunch of stuff going on. So yeah, join with us 2 weeks from now. What's Kit covering in the sermon there?
The conversion of Paul.
Conversion of Paul. That's a fun topic.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, especially right after MTOC, it should be topical. But yeah, without anything else to talk about, I think that's all we got for you. Share this if you find it helpful. We hope that this has been a blessing to you. Pray that God gives you guys peace in the political landscape and in the election coming up, and that we can trust God in all through it. But with that, I got nothing else for you, so we'll see you next time.
Ciao.